I am here from Chicago, here on the IIT campus, and I'm here to share some experiences with you regarding modern architecture and its preservation, and modern architecture as cultural heritage. Um, Clearly, when the Schiller building was demolished, these were very different times in terms of understanding of what exactly constitutes a historic building. Now, one must remember that in America, the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted in 1966. So before 1966, there were no mechanisms for which you could preserve a building from demolition. And the National Preservation Act required that the building be at least 50 years old in order to be considered historic. A funny and beautiful exception to that was S.R. Crown Hall, which was completed in 1956. But already in the early 2000s, they wanted to make it into a national register, a landmark. But it was 2001, which meant that the 50 years required for it by the National Historic Preservation Act were not actually yet there. So they made an exception because of Crown Hall's not only importance as a structure, but also as a place where architectural education radically changed the way architects in America, at least, and operated. So back to the era where Nickel was fighting to save the Garrick from imminent demolition. Folks here in Chicago did not have the mentality of thinking of the modern, if you can call it modern, Late Prairie as something that should be restored. IIT campus is on the south side of Chicago. For those who are outside of Chicago, it is not so easy to understand that this Chicago is a huge metropolis, north, south, east, west. And when I say the south side, it has a very specific, resonance. It's like me talking about Venezia and saying that Venezia is the Lido or the Giudecca. There are radically different presences. And so why am I talking about IIT and the South Side? Well, it was precisely, recall, Nickel was a student at the Institute of Design. The Institute of Design was part of Crown Hall. On the upper floor, there was architecture, and on the lower floor, there was the Institute of Design. That's how Vinci, who was then an architecture student, met Nickel, who was then a photography student. And so they were, as you can imagine, a spontaneous meeting in Crown Hall. They decided that they both were interested in Sullivan. And what did they do? They could just walk outside of Crown Hall, and 5 minutes away was Dankmar and Adler's now called the Pilgrim Baptist Church. So around this area, there was a number of Sullivan buildings that were being torn down. Why is that? They were being torn down because Mies van der Rohe had designed a master plan that basically provided for tearing down huge swaths of the neighborhood. So it is a bit of a paradox, that in order to, that Nickel, who was in the building that Mies had designed, possibly his most important building here in Chicago, that then went out and saw that the destruction, of course, not only by the IIT campus, but it was during those years in America, it was referred to as urban renewal. So huge swaths of the city, and especially the South Side, because the South Side was deemed poor and African American. And so basically all of these very difficult dynamics of demolition and displacement of all the people that were living in these buildings happened while the IIT campus and Mies buildings were coming up. Okay, so to summarize, 1966 is a kind of critical juncture in America's understanding itself as historic. Right? Of course, America went back to the Native Americans, so it was very much historic. But in terms of the European understanding of the what means historic, that was part of it. And so during the years that the Schiller came down, the Roby was being threatened to come down. And so there was a shift gradually, thanks also to people like John Vinci and Richard Nicol, in understanding that one needs to take care of these buildings. And remember, from an institutional point of view, where do architects learn how to restore buildings? Okay, IIT certainly didn't have a degree in preservation of historic buildings. So you have to understand that also our scientific approach today has been shaped by the fact that we actually now have degrees in preservation. Although, and this is very interesting for all of you who are in Venice and know all about Carlo Scarpa, John Vinci never trained as a preservation architect. In fact, he trained as an architect. Subsequent generations would train as preservation architects and perhaps would also be a little bit more orthodox in their approach to preservation. Vinci approaches preservation as an architect with great sensitivity to the historic building, not unlike Carlo Scarpa. But I'll take you back now to Chicago. So Richard Nicol was trained at the Institute of Design, and he was a photographer activist, right? In the way that perhaps Louis Hine would have been the turn of the century, photographing immigrants coming into Ellis Island. So this was a very new, I would say, identity. A photographer that is trying to do the work, not just to be published in Casabella, but in order to save these buildings, to raise awareness and to save these buildings from being demolished. So, and he was, he literally, and that led to his tragic death, he literally went into these buildings and deconstructed them to save them. So it was almost a desperate act, almost obsessive, but it required these were dangerous times for buildings, to use the title of a book that was published on his work. The then mayor Daley, the city was rising aggressively in terms of its need for buildings, so new buildings, new office buildings, and so clearly they needed to make room. Tragically, they would make room for what? For car garages, right? But I know you don't need cars in Venice, but remember, the car was the single most important engine of American mobility in the Second World War, after World War II. So, Schiller, Sullivan, car. Many Americans opted for a place where they can put their car. It's sad, but true. But again, those were times when, there had not been a culture of preservation that enabled people like Nicol to really have a greater impact beyond what he had. And it, ultimately, the real legacy of Nicol lives on, of course, in the figure of John Vinci. And John Vinci, I hold an endowed chair after his name. So I'm particularly, grateful to put forward his legacy through my own actions as an architectural historian and preservationist. I will say one last thing. Back to Nicol as being an activist photographer, that is very much part of the preservation movement in America still today. And what we really need is not only professors of architectural history writing books, we need professors of architectural history to fight for the safeguarding of buildings, because even within our classrooms, we need to encourage students to take the responsibility of advocating for the preservation of buildings of all eras. And of course, we all love books, but for those of us, those few that continue to want to read books, and we're getting always less and less, we need to work with the owners of buildings. We need to educate them about what they have, because without the owners and without a broader group of people helping, more and more buildings will be under threat, unfortunately, as we move forward. Docomomo, International, of course, jump-started our understanding of the need to both document and preserve modern movement. It subsequently generated a series of other national chapters. The American chapter goes back to the early 2000s. And remember, so we're in 2022, so that's not a lot of time for experts and advocates to create a culture whereby buildings are understood to be historic. And the paradox, too, of course, with the modern, is that modern architecture, at least a certain kind of modern architecture, was all projected to be new, avant-garde, shedding potentially historic references. So when you say, well, now the modern has become historic, of course, that also brings you to challenges. If you think about Italy, of course, has Docomomo. But, there's so much pressure on Italian cities to restore hundreds of buildings that predate the 20th century. Unless it's a masterpiece like the, Casa del Fascio by Terragni, many are struggling to take notice and to restore buildings that are only 60 or 70 years old in Italy, right? So I would say to your question, that you asked, what are the comparisons? Well, although I don't work in Italy, I would imagine that, there's only a certain amount of money to go around. And if they're understanding, well, do I save a Renaissance building? Do I save a neoclassical building? Or do I save a post-World War II building, in Turin? Well, I can imagine that the emphasis will be slightly more on the past. But this is, I'm just saying, as from the outside. So I think that philosophically, modern architecture posed challenges to the very idea of preserving, because preservation was seen as something that was part of a historic mentality. But as we've seen, if you don't preserve buildings, you have nothing to write about. And my friend Gunny Harbo, who's been involved in preservation of Wright buildings, of course, the Rookery, historic Chicago school buildings, as well as Crown Hall, always tells me that, Michelangelo, if you do not save buildings from being torn down, there will be nothing to write about. And so it is also true, of course, that the archives remain, and all of you have done a wonderful job trying to figure out the building post-demolition by way of the drawings. And so there's opportunities there, but it remains still a challenge to promote a culture of preservation and stewardship.